Scapegoating. Let's say you're at a family gathering when suddenly your cousin shatters a vase like they're auditioning for a glass-smashing competition. Before you can blink, everyone's looking at you, the poor soul with a sandwich in one hand and zero involvement in the crime. Now you're stuck with the blame while your cousin is off eating cake. That's scapegoating, a way to shift all the blame to someone else because the real culprit doesn't want to deal with the consequences. Historically, the term comes from an ancient ritual where people would symbolically load up a goat with all their sins and send it packing into the wilderness. They believe that the goat is now carrying all their sin, even though the poor goat never signed up to be the world's first emotional support animal. Yet there it was, innocently carrying centuries of human bad behavior on its fuzzy little back. The reason why scapegoating works is because it is easier to point fingers at someone else than to agree you messed up. It's like trying to get out of a speeding ticket by telling the officer that the driver in front of you made you drive fast. Door in the face technique. You walk into a showroom to shop for a sofa, and the salesman shows you this gigantic, plush, top-of-the-line sofa that costs more than your rent. You reject it faster than a lightning bolt strikes the ground, but then the salesman leads you over to a more reasonably priced option, and suddenly the deal looks as sweet as grandma's apple pie. That's the door in the face technique in action. First, they slap you with a request so outrageous that your wallet screams in horror. Then they follow it up with something so reasonable, you feel like you're practically saving money by comparison. This strategy is designed in such a way that it makes you feel like you're being reasonable. After rejecting a huge request, you'd feel kinda guilty. So when a smaller one comes along, it looks like a steal. It's like when your toddler asks for a pony and you say no, then they ask for a cookie, and at that point, you feel obligated to toss them a snack because at least it's not a pony. Mirroring. Mirroring is like the less awkward cousin of mimicking. It's a simple yet effective mind control trick where you copy someone's behavior, speech, or body language to trick them into thinking you're two peas in a pod. Because if they think you're alike, they'd trust you faster, and you can use it to gain influence over the person. It's basically the human version of a parrot copying your every move, but way more subtle. So let's say you're sitting in a coffee shop, and the person across from you is pulling a copycat routine. You take a sip of your coffee, they take a sip of their coffee. You lean in, they lean in. Suddenly it feels like you're synchronized in some sort of weird social dance. And before you know it, you'd start thinking you're on the same wavelength with the person, when in reality, they're just playing a game of Simon Says. You see, people naturally like people who are similar to them. It's like when you meet someone who hates pineapple on pizza, and suddenly you feel like you found your soulmate. That's the magic of mirroring. It's an unconscious way to make someone feel comfortable and familiar. It works because we humans are suckers for similarity, so when you see someone mirror your behavior, it taps into that subconscious part of you that makes the other person seem relatable. It's like that iconic Spider-Man meme, where both Spideys are pointing at each other like, wait, are you me? Negging. If you've ever played a game of dodgeball, you've got a sneaky glimpse into the world of negging, except instead of hurling softballs at you, they're throwing insults wrapped in a compliment's clothing. Basically, negging is when someone gives you backhanded compliments or subtle insults to chip away at your confidence until you're ripe for manipulation. It's like when you're on a date with your crush and they tell you, you're so smart for someone who never attended college. Now part of you wants to blush and say, thanks. But the other part is wondering if your crush just compared your intelligence with that of a goldfish. That's the essence of negging, makes you question yourself, while the other person looks like they're being nice, even though they aren't. It's like being given a bouquet of roses with hidden thorns. The goal of negging is to lower your self-esteem just enough that you begin to crave validation from the very person who insulted you. It's a manipulative move used to create a power imbalance. Negging works because, psychologically, you're wired to want approval from others. So when someone undermines you in a weird, underhanded way, it can trigger the need to prove yourself or seek validation. Fear-mongering. If you grew up in a Christian home, chances are you've been told 1,000,000 times that you'd burn in the eternal flames of hell if you stole a candy bar or lied about eating the last slice of pizza. This probably scared you so much that you never even attempted to tell a lie. This is a typical example of fear-mongering, the ultimate scare tactic that's less about haunted houses and more about haunting your thoughts. Basically, someone tries to control you by spreading fear that's usually exaggerated or sometimes totally made up. It's like the emotional version of a horror movie, except instead of jump scares, you're getting bombarded with worst-case scenarios and doomsday predictions until you're convinced the world's about to end. You see, fear-mongering thrives on exaggeration, and it works because fear is a powerful motivator. When you're scared, your brain switches to autopilot, making you more likely to act on impulse rather than fact. It's all about turning up the volume on fear until it drowns out any rational thinking. People who use fear-mongering as a mind control technique would simply take a small issue, turn it into a full-blown disaster scenario, and before you know it, you're doing things to favor them. Charm offensive. Charm offensive is kind of like eating too much candy. It's sweet and leaves you with a toothache of regret. It all begins with someone flooding you with kindness and over-the-top compliments, with a dazzling smile that could outshine a diamond, all to get something from you. It's that moment when your sister, who never speaks to you in front of her friends, suddenly starts praising you when her friends are around. Then, 10 minutes later, she's asking you not to tell mom that they threw a party in the house. You've just been hit with a charm offensive. You've been buttered up like a fresh piece of toast, and now you're agreeing to things you weren't even planning to do. Charm offensive is basically emotional camouflage. The charmers hide their true intentions behind compliments, smiles, and just the right amount of flattery. It's like they're wearing a superhero cape made of kindness, swooping in to save the day while secretly plotting to borrow your Netflix password. It works because humans love being appreciated and liked. It's in our DNA, kind of like our need for caffeine on a Monday morning. That's why when someone makes you feel good about yourself, you naturally want to return the favor. Charm offensive is a classic move in business. For example, if a company is facing a scandal or bad press, they'll often roll out the CEO with a shiny grin and some heartfelt apologies, ready to shake hands, kiss babies, and convince the world that everything's fine. Weaponized incompetence. So you tasked your son with doing the dishes. Instead of doing a decent job, he accidentally washes the plates with a sponge that still has yesterday's spaghetti sauce on it. After about 5 minutes, you're ready to take the sponge out of his hands and do it yourself, because watching this disaster unfold is almost painful. Your son just displayed weaponized incompetence. It's when someone pretends to be so bad at something that you have to swoop in to take over and eventually stop asking them to do it. It's a clever but sneaky way of dodging responsibility. Pure genius if you're lazy. In reality, your son is perfectly capable of doing the dishes, but washing the plates with spaghetti sauce has given him a lifetime excuse to avoid washing dishes forever. It's the domestic version of playing dead in a zombie apocalypse. And it's not just for chores. In the workplace, this tactic shows up when someone conveniently forgets how to use the printer every time they're asked to make copies. Yet they somehow become the reigning champion of every new video game that hits the market. By acting like they're lost, they make it your problem. What makes weaponized incompetence so sneaky is that the person isn't outrightly refusing to help, they just pretend to be so bad at it that you eventually stop asking. Isolation. Isolation as a mind control technique is like that moment when your phone dies and you suddenly realize how boring and lonely the world is without watching videos of The Analyst. Except instead of your phone dying, it's someone cutting you off from your friends, family, and support system so that you'd have no choice but to depend on that person. Suddenly, you're left with no choice but to depend on that one person who now holds the remote to your social life. Isolation is all about creating distance between you and anyone who might offer you a reality check or remind you that there's a whole world out there. They make you as dependent on them as your phone is on a charger at 1%. The reason why this technique works is because humans are naturally social creatures that thrive on connections. Take away those connections, and suddenly you're as vulnerable as a smartphone without a protective case. You'd be left feeling vulnerable and reliant on the one person who still seems to be around, and that's the manipulator. They'll make you think they're the only one who has your best interests at heart, and would even claim it's for your own good. But if we're being honest, it isn't. Isolation is especially common in relationships, and usually starts small. Maybe your girlfriend innocently suggests that your friends are bad influences, or she keeps you so busy that you stop calling your family. Soon you're noticing that it's been weeks since you've hung out with anyone but your girlfriend. You're practically spending more time with her than your phone spends in your hand. It's like going from being the life of the party to starring in a one-person show. False dichotomy. So, you and your mom are attending a birthday party where there's an all-you-can-eat buffet that looks like it was inspired by a foodie's wildest dreams. However, she tells you that the only thing you're allowed to have at the party is the salad or french fries. It's like going to Disneyland and being told you can only ride the teacups or watch others have fun. She has basically boxed you into two choices, even though there are literally way more delicious options to pick from. What your mom just did to you is a typical example of false dichotomy. It's when someone tells you there are only two options, but in reality there's a whole buffet of possibilities they're conveniently leaving out. It's basically the my way or the highway of arguments, except there's usually a nice scenic route, or a few dozen other highways they didn't mention. It's as if someone is trying to sell you a car but only shows you the 2 least appealing models in the lot, and it's not the flashy sports car or the reliable sedan, but the one that sputters and the one that's constantly breaking down. When someone uses false dichotomy on you, they aim to limit your options in such a way that it feels like there's only one acceptable path forward. Before you know it, you're trapped into making a decision that just so happens to benefit the person presenting the options. Projection. Projection is a bit like a magician's trick. While you're distracted looking at the hat, the magician is slipping a rabbit up his sleeve. Then when the fluffy surprise pops out, you're shocked, wondering where the rabbit came from. Now, the way you'd identify projection is when someone takes their own insecurities or flaws and tosses them your way, like they're hot potatoes. It's kind of like a game of emotional dodgeball, where you're suddenly getting hit with problems that aren't even yours, leaving you confused and surprised. It's the psychological equivalent of someone eating a garlic-loaded pizza and then blaming you for the smell. They're taking what's going on inside them and insisting it's actually all about you. Projection works as a mind control technique because it puts you on the defensive faster than a cat spotting a cucumber. You're just so busy defending yourself against these unfounded accusations that you don't have time to notice the accuser's own faults. The whole idea behind projection is to dodge responsibility and accountability. Instead of owning up to their own behavior, people who project just throw it onto someone else, like a hot potato of insecurity. They don't want to deal with their mess, so they make it your mess. Minimization. Imagine you've just spilled coffee on your favorite shirt and you're understandably upset, but then your friend comes along and instead of offering sympathy, he's telling you it's not a big deal, and even tells you a story of how he accidentally burnt his own shirt. What's playing out in this situation is minimization. It is that moment when someone takes your feelings or concerns and shrinks them down to the size of a pebble. It's like turning your emotional mountain into a molehill, making you question if you're really the drama king or queen of the century. A person using minimization would essentially downplay your feelings to make it seem less important, which would then make you feel like you were overreacting in the first place. A typical example of minimization is when a company accidentally spills oil into the ocean, and the company assures the public that the spill is being managed effectively. Meanwhile, marine life is auditioning for the next Finding Nemo sequel with a darker, oilier twist. By minimizing the spill, the company aims to dodge backlash and expensive cleanup costs. Minimization works because it messes with your perception of what's normal or acceptable to feel. They make your concerns seem minor so they can avoid responsibility or sidestep addressing the issue. Information overload. Picture this. You're Googling how to bake a cake, and suddenly you're knee-deep in articles about the history of flour, the science behind rising agents, 47 different frosting techniques, and a deep dive into the importance of cakes in ancient Greece. You're now left confused, thinking about what you were trying to do in the first place. What you're experiencing is information overload at its finest. It happens when your brain gets bombarded with so much information that you no longer know what to do or what choice to make. Information overload would make it harder for you to make decisions, and it leaves you feeling more confused than when you started. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. You're getting way too much at once, and instead of feeling refreshed, you're drenched, confused, and a little bit stunned. In today's world, information overload is everywhere. You open your phone to check the weather, and 10 minutes later, you're scrolling through breaking news, cat videos, 20 unread emails, and an ad for a blender you didn't know you needed. The funny thing is that the more information you get, the harder it becomes to make decisions. It's like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet and piling your plate with lasagna, sushi, taco, meatballs, and cheesecake. By the time you sit down, you're too overwhelmed to even start eating. Marketers and media are pros at exploiting information overload. They'd practically bombard you with so many ads that you'd end up buying or paying for that subscription just to make it stop. Intermittent reinforcement. You know how sometimes a vending machine dispenses candy, and other times it just stubbornly holds onto your coins like a miserly banker and doesn't dispense your candy, yet you're back to the same machine the next day hoping you'll finally get that candy. This is basically how intermittent reinforcement works. It's when someone gives you inconsistent rewards or approval, keeping you hooked like a Netflix series you just can't stop binge watching, even when the plot makes no sense. This way, you keep seeking validation from them, and they get to call the shots, turning your relationship into their personal puppet show. Think of it like being stuck in a psychological casino where you keep pulling the slot machine handle because sometimes it pays out, and you're convinced that just one more pull will hit the jackpot. Spoiler alert, you're hooked because you never know when the next reward is coming, and your brain loves that suspense. Intermittent reinforcement is sneaky because it's more addictive than regular rewards. If you know you'll get a treat every time you do something, you'll eventually take it for granted. But when rewards are unpredictable, your brain goes into overdrive, thinking, maybe this time, maybe now. It's like waiting for a text back that might never come, but you keep checking your phone every 5 minutes anyway. That's why gamblers keep betting, and why that one claw machine at the arcade always has a line of people thinking this is their lucky moment. Imagine training a dog with this technique. Instead of giving it a treat every time it sits, you reward it sometimes. Now the dog is sitting, spinning, and doing backflips, just hoping for that one biscuit. The dog is confused, but it's hooked, kind of like humans who are left guessing when they'll receive that next compliment, high five, or slice of pizza.